Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure how many we have on WebEx, but welcome to all of you who are here. Welcome to all of you on audio. Apparently, this is being streamed, so let me just start with a quick introduction of our presenters and our sole discussant. We had two starting this morning, but and just to give you a sort of the overview of how we're presenting this session today. My name is Shobha Shetty. I'm the practice manager for food and agriculture in the South Asia region. We have two great speakers with us today. Very happy to have with us Emmy Simmons and Professor Patrick Webb. So they will jointly be presenting the GLOPAN recommendations. Emmy, let me just give you a brief bio. I don't think this does justice to either of you, but I'll go through it quickly. Emmy Simmons is an independent consultant on international development issues with a focus on food, agriculture, and Africa. She serves as co-chair of AGRI, an initiative that brings together a diverse group of interests to transform U.S. food and agriculture policy to meet the challenges of the future, and as a non-resident senior advisor to the CSIS Global Food Security Project. She's a member of the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition, an international group focused on developing evidence-based policies to increase access to healthy, safe, and affordable diets. She also serves on the boards of several organizations engaged in international agriculture and global development more broadly, including the World Vegetable Center, the Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa, and she sits on several advisory committees for initiatives focused on agricultural development in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. She completed a career of nearly 30 years with the USAID in 2005, having served since 2002 as the Assistant Administrator for Economic Growth, Agriculture and Trade, a presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed position. Prior to joining USAID, she worked in the Ministry of Planning and Economic Affairs in Liberia and taught and conducted research at Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria. She began her international career as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines from 1962 to 64 and holds an MS degree in agricultural economics from Cornell University and a BA degree from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. And our second speaker is Professor Patrick Webb. Maybe not all of it, yes. Is the Alexander McFarlane Professor of Nutrition at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. He's engaged in research and policy guidance around the globe as director for USAID's Feed the Future Nutrition Innovation Lab. And until 2005, also worked for UN WFP as Chief of Nutrition. He's also an honorary professor at Hohenheim University and has a faculty position at the Fletcher School of Law at Tufts University. Okay, so what we'll do is well, I haven't introduced my good friend here. So Steve Jaffee, I'm sure many of you know him, is currently based in, no, I have it actually, is lead ag economist and the global solutions lead on food quality. He's currently based in Singapore, and his research, policy and investment project work during his 2.5 decades at the bank has spanned multiple areas, including food and nutrition security, agricultural risk management, trade and SPS standards, agricultural modernization, and agro-environmental policy. He's had considerable field experience in Southeast Asia and Africa, and is currently leading a major study on the economics of food safety capacity building. Steve holds a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and a DPhil in agricultural economics from Oxford University. So as you can see, we have a very distinguished panel here today. Meera Shekhar, who's actually our second discussant from HNP, unfortunately is sick and sends her apologies, so she won't be able to make it this afternoon. So what we'll do is we'll start with, I think Emmy will start with the presentation, and Patrick will continue. And we'll then have Steve come in to make a few remarks on the operational relevance of the GLOPAN's report for the bank. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. Your team is also here.
Yes, and
Do you
I'll
mind
introduce
pointing?
them.
Okay, you
I'll
will introduce them.
yeah.
Okay. And then we'll hopefully wrap up by 3.
this afternoon. And we hope that there are hundreds and thousands on the WebEx version here. Do you have a mechanism so they can put in questions or whatever at the end?
Ira would know.
Ira's not here? Okay. Okay. In any case, it's great. Were any of you last week at the Agriculture and Food week-long thing out in Tyson's? Yeah, a couple of you? All right, good. Because I was there as well and really enjoyed that opportunity. But today I'm here with my global panel on agriculture and food systems for nutrition hat, and have the great pleasure of really focusing in on a recent report that was prepared over the last year, mid-year, and we think pulls together information that has never been kind of pulled together in this format before. Hi, Jonathan. Have a chair. Hi. How are you? Tanzania. Here we come. So the report that Patrick Webb, who is our policy and evidence coordinator, and I are going to briefly introduce is called Food Systems and Diets, Facing the Challenges of the 21st Century. And hard copies are available outside, and soft copies, should you want to share this with all your friends, are on the Global Panel website, glopan.org, just so that we have the advertisements done. But who are we? What is the Global Panel? In looking at this slide, I thought it might actually be useful to say, why is there a global panel, and then talk about who we are. We are when the Olympics were held in London back in 2012, there was a great initiative on the part of the British government, and with some support from the Gates Foundation, to take that opportunity of a focus on sports and health and food to convene a Nutrition for Growth Summit. And the ideas that came out of those meetings, those events, the discussions around them, led to the idea that, in fact, a high-level panel called the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition should be established. And it was decided it should be an independent group, not associated with the UN organizations, and really focusing in on the challenges of food, diets, and nutrition. I personally have been involved my whole career, as you heard, with food and agriculture, and have been frustrated for many, many years with a lot of people working on agriculture, a lot of people working on nutrition, and not much of a connection between them. And so when I heard the name of the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition, I was thrilled. And I was totally happy to be invited to be one of the key members of the panel. As you can see from all these pictures, it's a relatively small panel, giving us the opportunity to get together, not frequently, but parts of us to get together relatively frequently. Akinwumi Adesina, who was the Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria at the time he joined the Global Panel, is now the head of the Director General for the African Development Bank, which is fabulous. The two Johns on there, Sir John Beddington and President John Kufuor, co-chair the panel and bring just a wealth of experience in science, in agriculture, in food systems, in politics to bear. So they are key members. And then you can see the other ones, and we're also listed in the books. Of course, the panel, because it is so small, would get absolutely zero done were it up to us to get together and actually have a conversation, sponsor an event, do any publications, commission any analyses. So while we have a very active agenda, and this slide gives you a feeling for some of the 2017 activities that the Global Panel will be undertaking, it is because we have a secretariat headquartered in London, headed by Professor Sandy Thomas, who's sitting right here in the second row, and supported by a staff, two of whom are in the very last row, Catherine LeBlanc and Darren Hughes, that because we have this secretariat staff who kind of does the moving and shaking and scheduling and contracting, we are actually able to get things done, and our activity agenda moves forward. This year just gives you this 2017 gives you a flavor of the kinds of events that we have used as a panel to advance the analysis, discussion, negotiations, awareness, etc. We're having a meeting in Brasilia with Dr. Mauricio Lopez from Embrapa, some of you may know him. Another high-level event in Nigeria with the Federal Minister for Agriculture and Rural Development, who actually replaced Akin. African Development Bank Group annual meeting, somewhat surprisingly being held in India this year, as some Asian countries are actually investors in the bank. So it gives you kind of a flavor of an engagement at a high level, an engagement with decision makers, and an engagement with political leaders. And to me, this has been one of the real advantages and one of the comparative advantages of this panel. This particular project that Patrick Webb is going to spend more time presenting to you and discussing with you is kind of the core work that was done in 2016. Many of the panel members were engaged. Patrick, the Secretariat, several commission analysts were brought on board in order to be able to really undertake this ambitious look at the relationship between food systems and how they are evolving, and diets. Many people say, well, yeah, food systems, they just kind of work on their own, and people have choices, and they make choices, and they eat. But the question is, as we know in this day and age, that malnutrition on the undernutrition side is actually substantially smaller in terms of the number of people globally who are affected than the number of overweight and obese people. And micronutrient malnutrition continues apace. And so clearly there's some disconnect between what a food system is offering to consumers and how it's working and what's directing it and driving it, and what it is that people are actually eating and the health impact, or the impact on their health that it has. So this foresight project was, as I said, very ambitious. We tried, the team, the task force that took on the analytical work was asked to look at trends across the board in both food systems and consumer behavior and diets, and to pull together evidence about that would indicate with some degree of certainty sort of where what the future looked like. And the added value, we believe, on the panel of this particular project was actually taking this broader look at not just at agriculture and how much agriculture needed to be produced, but how that agricultural supply actually was translated through the processing, delivery, retailing, wholesaling, and got into people's hands, and they actually cooked it and or ate it. Cooked it, ate it, I don't know. Anyhow, so it was a question of trying to sort of look much more broadly than many of the studies that we had been able to identify before. It runs to 2035, which is a little bit different than the SDGs, but obviously there's an alliance linkage with the SDG time frame. And we attempted to draw on the best science, evidence, and advice by bringing in a task force, by having several meetings to discuss the issues that were emerging as the analysis went on, and then to distill all this complexity into priorities for action. I have to tell you that if you look at the call to action toward the end of the report, you will still be surprised at how many actions there are that are recommended. And I think that reflects the complexity of the issues that we're addressing and the number of opportunities within a food system to intervene in ways that kind of change a trend, change a trajectory of availability, supply, quality, affordability, taste, appeal, all of the aspects of consumption that we know are important in the food environment. So with that, I'm going to turn over the heavy lifting here to my colleague Patrick Webb. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmy. Thanks for that introduction. Welcome. Great also to have the tens of thousands of people on the WebEx. I just got the number passed by here. No. Complex. All right. Now, the three takeaways I'm going to start with the takeaways, the final messages. One, this is called Food Systems and Diets for a reason. It doesn't mention agriculture and it doesn't mention nutrition. right? But this is core to that nutrition-sensitive agenda that links agriculture to not to nutrition. It's a two-way and multi-way agenda. But what we're trying to push is the idea that understanding how the quality of diets evolve, how they're shaped, who influences them, and what happens to a consumer when they have to make choices in what they eat, that matters both to agriculture and nutrition as well as health. Right? So the quality of diets is something we need to pay a lot more attention to. That means the complexity comes from not working within sectors but across sectors. Nothing new there for people who work in nutrition. But the solutions to this complexity reside not just with agriculture, not just with trade, but across the various legislative policy levers, taxation, subsidies, in other domains as well. So it's an important bridge between agriculture and nutrition and health and across different sectors. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is support improved choices, right? It's still about the individual. We're still concerned with what an individual puts in their mouth every day, hopefully every day. But we need to support those choices. They're not automatic. They're not always informed by the best science, the best understanding, the ability to access the right foods. So what we're looking at here is, yes, of course, we're looking at systems, but we're also trying to look at how to support individuals within those systems. Right? So that's really the takeaway. Now, we just heard from Emmy, just came out from WHO, malnutrition in all its forms. That's the term we need to embrace if we're going to look at diets, because diets are a link. They're a linchpin between all these forms of malnutrition, very large numbers of overweight and obese, still very large numbers of women of reproductive age who are anemic. These are, of course, framed by the World Health Assembly and the SDG nutrition targets. We know there are at least another 2 billion, there's another 2 billion people who have various forms of micronutrient malnutrition. So when you put together vitamin and mineral deficiencies with the various forms of undernutrition, which is wasting, stunting, and other forms of undernutrition, as well as the overweight and obesity, we have huge problems to address here that can't just be addressed, mustn't just be addressed through public health means and through targeted nutrition interventions, but have to be addressed more systematically, and the diet offers one way to do that. Multiple nutrition problems are in all countries in the world now, right? And 193 countries in the world have a nutrition problem of one kind or another. In many cases, multiple kinds, right? So it's not something, malnutrition is no longer restricted to low-income settings. Every country in the world has a nutrition problem. And when you look at, this is just from a paper from a couple of years ago, Ugo Gentilini here from the bank, you look at large countries like Nigeria and India that have still major problems with child stunting, high prevalence rates, and very large problems with anemia and wasting, but also have growing obesity problems as well. And it's not just them. Smaller countries, in a similar way, are struggling just first to deal with the problems of wasting and stunting, but they have growing obesity, they have growing micronutrient deficiencies in many cases. Now, this poses a challenge to policymakers across sectors. There's no one mechanism, one policy, one agenda that can resolve all of these issues at once unless we take a systemic view, unless we look at the food system and diets and what role that plays as a linkage between agriculture and health. Now, diets. Why focus on diets? Well, it's been a wake-up call. Recent, and I mean recent, in the last 5 years, the number of studies that are looking globally at the role of diets. And here I mean what foods people do eat or don't eat enough of, right? But both of those things characterize a diet. And what we've come to learn most recently through the public health literature primarily is that diets are today the major contributor to the global burden of disease. right? So what used to be tobacco or HIV or malaria, it's still that in some countries, but globally it's dietary factors that carry the greatest weight. They are the main contributor to the global burden of disease, of all diseases, right? This is a wake-up call for a lot of people, right? They don't realize necessarily, or have only come to realize very recently, that what we're eating or not eating is killing us. And it is that radical. It is that important. Now, one of the things that the large group of people who were involved in the Foresight activity, I'm going to throw you a few of these things from the Foresight report, which you can look here. Diets are complex. We know actually surprisingly very little about them, and they don't always work the way we would like them to work. So one thing, they're not improving necessarily over time. So looking at data consistent from 1990 to 2013, you can see these different colors are different regions in the world. For fruits and nuts and seeds, we've seen an increase in consumption of fruits and nuts and seeds in all of the major regions of the world over that period, which is great. Those are two of the so-called virtuous food groups that everyone should be eating more of, and that includes me, as well as most of you. But it's not the same for whole grains. It's not the same for omega-3 fatty acids, which are equally important to reducing that global burden of disease. In some countries, like Southeast Asia, you can see increases, or East Asia to some extent. In other regions, you see decrease over that period, right? So with rising incomes, we assume there's rising choice and there's rising access to the foods we need, yes, energy, basic protein, but we can't assume that the diet, the quality of the diet, the composition of the diet improves with it, and that's a problem. Those were mostly of the good foods. Now, there's other foods that people challenge as being beneficial to the diets. And across all regions of the world, processed, mainly red meats have been increasing, not only identified as potentially carcinogen by WHO, but processed red meats have been increasing everywhere. Trans fats have been decreasing across most regions, which points to entry point successes for policy, right? Trans fats have been declining because they've been identified and governments have acted and said, remove these from our food system because they are bad. And so we need to keep in mind that there are important successes and we need to capitalize on that. Because if we don't make big progress very soon, we're facing a major increase in the already huge health burden associated with bad diets. It's not just the continuing underweight and micronutrient deficiencies, it's overweight and obesity globally, which is by 2030 expected to more than double, including in low and middle income countries with many amazing effects. Now, I just saw this, for the target for SDG 3 coming out, data from WHO. This is the probability of dying, the blue line, the probability of dying from various diseases, cardiovascular, cancer, diabetes, and so on, before, let's just say young, before the age of 70. That's young, right? So before 70, definitely. And what I want to point out here is that countries like already Cote d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone, Sudan, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea have much higher probabilities of dying from those problems, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, than countries like Canada, Iceland, Republic of Korea, and Australia, right? This is no longer a high-income country problem. The risk of mortality for these diet-related chronic diseases has now arrived in a big way in lowest-income countries, where many of them are still struggling with stunting and anemia, for example. Right? This is a huge challenge that we have to embrace, we have to understand. Now, the only reason this is here is that some people many of you know about agriculture systems. We're not just talking about agriculture in understanding food systems. It goes the whole gamut, right? You have to look at storage and food quality, food safety, transportation, processing, transformation. marketing, retail, right? All of these matter, and those of you who were there this morning from the FAO talk, there was a clear statement: we need to look at the entire food system if we, the World Bank in this case, are to embrace the agenda of nutrition-sensitive actions. We have to look at the entire food system. That was from 10:30 this morning, so I won't repeat it. But what we do need to understand is the inner circles. Everyone understands the outer circles, the supply chain that generates food into a system that is transported, traded, transformed. What we are trying to understand is how do we affect the circles within that, the food environment in which foods are marketed, are accessible or not, and the diet quality that it materializes from consumer choice, right? And choice is always not, it's often conditioned or constrained choice. It's constrained by information, social norms, access, price, you name it. There's lots of constraints to choice. And we have to understand how to improve actions across this system to enable people to have the high-quality diet. One example, in these countries in South Asia, if you met what is widely called the 5 a day, 5 fruits and vegetables a day, although now we hear from the UK it really should be 10 a day, right? So, but just 5 a day. 52% of household income would have to be spent on food to be able to meet that, right? And that's not a surprise to many people who understand how relative prices, consumer prices, in a lot of countries, the line down the middle, the bars to the right are increases in prices during that period of 1990 to 2010. To the left are decreases in those prices of these foods. These are high and middle income countries, and what you can see is things like big increase in the price of fruits and vegetables, but also some of the grains, the whole grains, fish, and then, of course, you see a decrease in things like sweet biscuits, chocolates, ready meals, and ice cream. I'm pretty happy about that last one, but the others are problematic, right? So relative prices that change over long term, and we need to be looking more at this, right? Don't just tell people you need to eat 5 a day. Go off and do it. Well, hang on, it takes half of my income to do that? Well, let's be a little serious and let's figure out what that really means for everyone. A different example from Uganda, work from the Nutrition Innovation Lab by Jerry Shively at Purdue, the red line being the locally derived poverty line, and different markets within Uganda. You can see the actual cost of meeting a minimally adequate nutritious diet in those places in Uganda over a long period of time. And I'm sorry, the poor are simply not able to come close to that minimally nutritious diet. Something has to change, and it's not just grow more food, and it's not just poverty reduction, right? Both of those, I think we've put that one aside. We need to address it in additional ways, not just other ways. We do know there's growing evidence of the economic costs of not doing anything, the cost of inaction to national GDP, to individual household earnings down the road. The Mira Shekhar here and others have done a lot on costing the cost-benefit ratio of targeted nutrition actions, 16 to 1. For every dollar invested in targeted nutrition actions at scale, you get $16 in return at a national level through productivity enhancement, reduced healthcare costs, and so on. There's a lot of evidence about the danger of not acting, and that's only going to grow bigger. What we do need to do more is figure out how and what it's going to cost to achieve this. This is from the World Bank's investment document for nutrition. How do we achieve sufficient diets defined in terms of quantity as well as quality and diversity, right? Sufficient diets, not just the nutrition outcomes. We need to cost this out, we need better evidence of what works, and we need dissemination. Part of what the Global Panel has been doing is trying to develop tools to think through the problem, think through these challenges. How should we approach the problem? What things do we need to ask? What evidence do we have of policy innovation and programmatic success in improving diets, not growing more food, not purchasing more on food necessarily, not consumption, but diets. What is the evidence base? One of the things that surprised everyone on the global panel and all those involved was how poor the data are on what people actually eat day to day around the world. It's astonishing how little solid, comparable, standardized evidence there is, right, at this day and age. Really, it's astonishing how huge the black hole is. The team put together in Nature Foresight piece that tried to hone it down to a research agenda which is framed by that lack of evidence, lack of data, lack of systematized knowledge. There's a lot to be done here in terms of building the evidence base. And a lot of this isn't just about developing countries, right? The US's own National Nutrition Research Roadmap that Ahmed Kablan was involved in, I see him sitting here. One of the things they talk about just for the US is that we have to prioritize research on the causal relationships between diets and disease. So I'm putting this out there to say we don't know everything, right? There's a research agenda here, an evidence-building agenda that has to be built up. However, we can't afford to wait. It's one of those stories. We have to figure out what people are doing and how effective it is. A paper, a journal article that just came out last week that's getting a lot of traction globally from the JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, looking at dietary factors and stroke, diabetes, and all the rest of it, came out with a clear conclusion. Too much salt, too much processed meats in your diet, you die. Okay. You're going to die anyway. Not enough nuts and seeds, omega-3s, fruits and vegetables, you're still going to die. But hey, you get my point, right? There is growing and an accretion of evidence that suggests that we actually know a lot about what shouldn't be eaten, what should be eaten. What we know less about is how to ensure that everyone gets the right mix. And that involves the private sector. That involves essential marketing and infrastructure investment. Now, we don't yet have all the evidence. An editorial on that very paper said, yeah, we can critique it on this, this is an observational study, an epi study. We need more intervention studies. We need to understand that some of the precision is impossible because we don't have the data. However, the likely benefits are so substantial that they justify policy action to improve diet quality today. Right? This is an editorial from this past week. So what do we do? So I'm not going to go into all the detail. What we try and do in the Foresight report is look at what kinds of policy actions, policy levers are being used today, what are potential modifications, and where is innovation possible. These aren't prescriptions, they're just illustrations. What we need is a lot more flesh put around these bones. Who is doing what where, particularly in low-income settings? What is it costing? What can we do to engage small and medium-term enterprises? What can we do in regulation and labeling, encouraging and enhancing the good stuff, maybe taxes on the bad stuff? I'm obviously editorializing here. Tax incentives, maybe subsidies. There's so much subsidy on basic energy production, there's major grains around the world, and almost nothing by comparison on all the virtuous foods. So the relative weight we put on as a society to taxes and subsidies for different kinds of foods. We're generating and will be testing in different countries, policy tools that will enable governments to think through and do this kind of analysis, not just from an agricultural lens, but along the policy change. So really, this report, and I'm wrapping up, is a call to action. It's an attempt to put diets front and center, diets within food systems front and center. Some of the specific recommendations that Emmy was talking about, some of them are low-hanging fruits, like food-based dietary guidelines. Actually, it's surprising how few low-income countries have dietary-based guidelines that are specific to their own countries. But those should not be, in the traditional sense, just consumer-focused. Go away and do this and eat that. Right? They need to be formulated in ways that they guide policymakers in terms of the policies that will enable that to happen. needs to be done in a two-way space with a scientific underpinning. We need to make fruits, vegetables, pulses, nuts, and seeds, and fish, all the good stuff more available, safer, more accessible, more attractive, more feasible to consume by more people. Policies around animal source foods, always contentious. What I said about processed red meats, that's processed red meats, right? Animal source foods are critical to addressing some of the micronutrient issues and undernutrition in certain settings. What there needs to be is the right balance, right? Not too little as well as not too much. I'll just give you one very quick example of that. This is looking paper from the British Medical Journal. Food availability, right? This is not what people eat, it's what's available by different categories in relation to changes in child stunting and ischemic heart disease, so heart problem, cardiovascular problems. And if it's a negative, in this case, in countries where meat and dairy products were more available over time, stunting declined. Right? So in some countries, you absolutely need more meat and dairy to address the undernutrition problems. The problem is, in other settings, more meat and dairy had the negative effect of increasing heart disease and stroke and the other things, right? So we know this inherently, but the data are finally being able to tell us. So it's not a one-size-fits-all policy. We have to figure out how to manage the policies around individual foods to shape diets better. So fruits and vegetables, probably one of the most universal. More fruits and veg, you got less stunting. More fruits and veg, you got less heart disease. Okay, great. 10 a day. Right? You got that particular message, if you can afford it. Starchy roots and sugars and sweeteners, we kind of heard, I think we've heard by now that we probably moderate our consumption of sugars and so on. Where they have increased in conditions of stunting, then stunting increased. Right? So we have to be aware of this complexity, different foods for different actions. So we need to be looking at formulation, how do we encourage healthier foods more to be produced within a nutritious diet, labeling, taxes, accountability. Part of this is not new. Right? We need to work across sectors, break down barriers within governments. We need the ag people to be talking, not just with the health ministry. This is going far beyond that. This is about trade. This is about food safety regulation. This is a whole other set. The chambers of commerce, right? There are new players that have to be brought into this. Institutional high-quality diets, so the quality of diets in schools, the quality of diets in prisons, the quality of diets in hospitals. They offer opportunities not just for procurement, but for education and advocacy around what needs to be done. And then the future of agricultural research, just to wake Jonathan up. We have to rethink what we're doing in terms of subsidies and investments in agricultural research in terms of the types of crops and the agendas that are behind ag research. We need to think the quality of diet, not just nutrition, not just food supply, both matter, but the quality of diet is the core. We need to think systems, not sectors. That's actually quite an important message. And we have to innovate, and while innovate, demonstrate through the collection of evidence of what works. We've done a really good job over the last couple of decades in the ag sector and in the health and nutrition sectors in doing exactly that. What works? How much does it cost? What are the success stories? We need at least the same effort for addressing diet quality. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Patrick and Emmy, for that really thought-provoking presentation. I think it's a bit daunting to realize that pretty much half the world's population is eating poorly, right? It's either too much or too little or not balanced. And I think your point about treating these as food systems rather than looking at them as sectors I think it's great, but it's I think for us operationally, I guess it's a challenge for us to work within sort of our respective sectors to try and get that systems mentality is it's easier said than done, right? So again, I mean, I think from the agriculture GP. Definitely, we as a corporate priority, we're really sort of trying to really sort of implement much more nutrition-sensitive approaches in our projects. But I mean, it is one of the most promising sectors in the sense that in terms of what you said about getting food safe, high-quality food, nutritious food available to poor and to urban and rural consumers. It's the agriculture sector that really has a big role to play in addition to health and so on. But I think it's also about, I mean, since it's a system, and you talked about the food safety and trade, I think we also have the importance of sort of the media and behavior change and all of everything that goes along with that, especially with increasing urbanization in many of these countries that we work in. So it's really sort of how you get your arms around this problem is just it's quite a challenge for us, I think, for those of us who are working on these issues.
Can I just interject
Sure.
there? Because one of the issues, for example, is a gender issue, and I don't know how many of you are working on that, but women's time and the convenience of foods in order to prepare a healthy diet turn out to be part of the what do we know about diets and what actually people buy and how they cook it and how they consume it and how they give it to their kids versus their husbands, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's even dimensions, right, of this, of how the food system works at the household level, within the household level, at the level, I think Patrick made this, at the level of the individual. And so that's really challenging us, I think, in a way of depth of analysis that we often don't like to do. We like to do just households, just average households.
On this, now that you've mentioned it, I have to make a plug for the kind of work that we are doing in South Asia, because the portfolio that I manage on the rural livelihood side essentially works with these women's groups, and in India in particular, the World Bank has supported almost 30 million women organized into these community self-help groups. And what we're looking at now in sort of our next generation of projects is really to see how we can leverage these institutional platforms to really deliver on some of our nutrition. Well, it's not just it's nutrition, it's health, it's sanitation, it's all of these, and really leveraging these platforms to get these messages across, and also now trying to take a look at what is happening in terms of the intra-household consumption, right? So, it's essentially, you need to make the women, the health and nutrition status of women then affects the children and so on. And as your numbers have pointed out, stunting figures are still extremely high in South Asia and India in particular. So yes, I mean, I think a lot of our, we have a number of programs in South Asia in particular that really focus on these, on women's empowerment and trying to use these institutional platforms to get at some of these messages through behavioral change and making this food accessible through either homestead gardens, backyard poultry, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let me stop here and maybe, Steve, your comments, observations.
All right. First of all, I think this is an excellent report. It makes a very complex subject accessible to a wide audience. It's got a nice time dimension. You sort of get the past, the present, and a view of the nasty future. And it's very practical. It has a practical agenda. And basically, Chapter 7, which outlines at the production level, logistics, transformation, retail, the range of instruments available, whether they're fiscal instruments or technical approaches or whatnot. So why isn't this happening on a very wide scale? And why is it not adding up? And my own view is that this is not a technical issue at all. This is the political economy of food. Right? So we have all these instruments, but these instruments are like a bucket of water. But we have a tsunami that we're facing. And the tsunami is, we basically have the big policy issues, which are agricultural policy, public spending in agriculture, trade policy, industrial policy, urban development policy.
Oops.
They're tending to swim in the other direction. And you combine that in developing countries, and you combine that with the global sort of relocation of the food and beverage industry and the fast food industry, and an urbanization process in low and middle income countries. We have a perfect storm here, right? So food policy in this country is captured by industry and others, and that's why it seems more complex than it really is. And our clients, they're even less well prepared to have an objective sort of societal perspective on how to promote a good diet. They don't have the experience that governments in industrial countries have they don't have the science, right? They don't have the evidence. They're trying to promote investment in certain industries. They're still trying to protect farmers. So the whole politics of food in many of the countries we work in is actually pushing in the other direction, and in some cases quite strongly. And that sort of leaves me sort of quite worried, even more worried than all the numbers, because look, we're struggling in so many countries to change the discussion from agricultural policy to food policy. And, part of the way of doing that is sort of embarrassing the Minister of Agriculture with the nutrition data, right, and the other things. But behind the spending pattern there and the trade restrictions and all this are vested interests also. So it's not simply we present it, it's a compelling case, we sort of see the way, good, give us these instruments and we'll apply them. But many food policy processes are now being captured in middle-income countries. We see the same issue when sugar taxes are proposed. It's exactly the same arguments about job loss. It's just mobilized and put in another context, and in a context where you don't have any countervailing power. You don't have civil societies, consumer organizations. So there's sort of no one over there other than sort of the practitioners who work in this who can answer to the combination of the sort of vested interest in the sort of salt, fat, sugar complex, or the government who's looking out for some other things as well, which in sort of the protection of farmers things, which gets us sort of at a higher price level, and you put the restrictions on trade, so that passes on to consumers the whole higher prices for healthy foods. So I don't want to make the problem more difficult than it is, but I think it is more difficult than it is. And to sort of use, and I'm not sure the way out of this, because this is a slow drip crisis, right? It's not like people wake up and the financial crisis and we have to do something. This is a steadily, slowly advancing thing, and I don't see how the trajectory gets changed without some very astute leadership that somehow is willing to have sort of one term in office. And look, in the United States, we see it it sort of happens at the city level. You know, you get a Mayor Bloomberg or something, right? Maybe some municipalities in middle-income countries will see that, but I'm not sure at the national level we're seeing it. Actually, we'd like you to come join us in Indonesia for some conversations on this, because this is the tack we're taking. We cannot influence ag policy, so we're trying to embarrass it with food issues. And so essentially our client becomes the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Planning. It's not the Ministry of Agriculture. So I'll end on that lovely note. But look, when we look at food safety, we sort of see that as a public good, right? So quality is a private issue, food safety is a public good issue. Is unhealthy food, can we equate that with unsafe food and sort of move this into being really legitimate areas for government to go more deeply in pushing back and being more of a nanny state, and that is perfectly acceptable given the what we're looking at. Anyway, I'll end.
Okay, thanks, Steve, for getting us even more depressed about these issues. Anyway, I think before sort of opening it up to questions and discussion, just a couple of quick housekeeping points. We do have some questions from the WebEx, so we'll take those. And also to the audience, that I think Emmy did mention it, but copies of the reports, the hard copies, are outside. And apparently there is no microphone in the room, so I have to repeat all questions for WebEx. You mean into the same mic here? Oh, okay. All right, so should we take a couple of questions from the WebEx then to start with?
I'm going to total 4 here on WebEx. I'll just start with the first 2, and then
Okay.
kind of go from there. So the first one is actually was asking if anyone on the panel has thoughts about policy approaches to improving essentially food systems, especially just looking for best practices that maybe come. And then another one is looking a bit more on some of the research you presented, Patrick, which is specifically you had the slide about stunting and heart disease for food type, and someone was kind of wondering where legumes might fall in that. She didn't see it on the list. Start with those. Thank you.
I would be happy to start on kind of some of the questions about how to get policy attention, which was, I think, your point, Steve, and it was reflected in the first question as well. I think in the U.S., this is not my global panel hat, but this is my agree hat. In the U.S., one of the kind of motivators for taking a food system perspective and looking at food policy is the horrifying rise in health costs. And so over the last 5-10 years, there have been a lot more discussions that involve not just the people from agriculture, but involve the people from the healthcare system saying, we cannot continue to have this rising level of cardiovascular disease. We cannot continue to absorb costs of diabetes without actually engaging in dietary modification, right? We just can't do this. And over the last 5 years, there's been an ability under Obamacare to do what are called community health assessments. And if you look at kind of the U.S. literature, it's still new, and Patrick probably knows better than I do the research on it, but a number of communities have taken advantage of that availability of funding to take holistic looks at their food systems and how people are eating and what kids are learning and exercise and sort of the whole ball of wax. And to me, that's a very positive kind of movement. When the health people kind of say, I'm looking at that burden of disease number and I'm saying, I can't just any longer say to someone who is wildly obese, well, you should eat a few more vegetables. That's just not going to cut it. I also see, both in Europe and in the U.S., as you said, metro area leaders taking the leadership and saying, look, we can do better with regard to the way that the food systems work in our city. We don't need to have whole areas of the city where poor people have access to fresh fruits and vegetables in convenience stores, 7-Eleven or whatever. That we need to take a much more holistic look at how the food system works and the Food Policy Council idea, which brings together the public sector, the private sector, the healthcare sector, the consumers, interest groups, just about everybody. There are dozens of examples as to how this can work and kind of framing of how to, as you say, make that really complicated thing. Because at a city level, mayors and county leaders can kind of get a grip on that. You know, do you only allow, I mean, one of the questions that was in a conversation I had in Detroit was, do you have a prohibition on delivery trucks coming into the city during the day? And meaning that they can't resupply with fresh fruit unless they come in at midnight. And how does that connect peri-urban farmers who don't normally harvest their crops at midnight? Right? How does that enable them to really participate in that market? And so, I mean, it's just fundamental kind of questions. So that to me are some positive things. When the health sector gets engaged in the taxpayers who pay for healthcare costs, that leads to questions for a better way to better diets. The food policy councils and the community health care services, I think, are a practical means of kind of getting a grip, rather than in a country like Indonesia where you have lots of islands, you have lots of different cultures, you have different food preferences. But it seems to me there are lots of opportunities out there that came up in preparing this report that are just being bypassed, you know, because people say, oh my God, it is too complicated and I just can't deal with it. So I think, I hope that, as you said, that the accessibility of this report, even though it still is pretty complicated, will help to do that. And I think that the global panel is very aware of the need to kind of push to kind of elucidate what some of these best practices are and to sort of promote that sharing of information, why we're here. And I don't know, Patrick, you want to pick up on it?
The legumes question?
Yeah. Well, first let me thank Steve for very thoughtful comments that I think are spot on. We wouldn't disagree with that. I think the political economy part is underpinning the high-level engagement, the high-level policy engagement of the panel members. But it's a heavy lift, you're right. Especially, let me just point out that there is no indicator of diet quality in the SDGs, right? We have nothing as a target and nothing to measure in relation to diet quality. If it's not there, if you don't measure it, there's no action around it. So that kind of political economy is really quite important. And I totally agree. Latin America, Chile, great example of municipalities zoning, nutrition zoning to avoid food deserts. And, there are good examples around there, really at the lower level, closer to the consumer, where it's demand. Just simply on the research, please look at the paper. I did. Pulses were in there, and you'll note I did say we recommend in the recommendations pulses, nuts, and seed, absolutely. More pulses or legumes are absolutely essential to the diet. In that analysis, however, for some reason, legumes, pulses did not come out as being a significant factor on their own in reducing stunting or improving heart disease. And it could be that maybe pulses interact with the grain, right? You eat pulses with rice. So these were food groups separated out. There were no interactions in that. So we just need to look more deeply at that, at those data. But the ones that did leap out were the ones I wanted to show.
Okay, thanks, Patrick.
thanks. This was a great session, and I look forward to reading the full report. You didn't mention anything at all about the work that's being done by Harvest Plus in biofortification. In the last 5 years, they've rolled out 15 crops commercially in 57 countries, which are fortified with iron, zinc, and vitamin A, which are proven to combat anemia, combat stunting, combat other diseases leading to blindness, especially. And today, there's an estimate that about 20 million people are eating biofortified staple foods. It seems to me that this is a really good way to get nourishment, vitamins and minerals to especially rural households that don't have access to the market to even buy the fruits and vegetables or the fish that might be better for them, because that's where the hidden hunger is. It's really in the rural areas. So I would just like to hear you comment on that, please. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe let's take these two questions first, and then we'll go for another round.
You want to lead off? You want to?
Maybe first summarize the question.
Yes.
Oh, okay. There was a question about biofortification and the work that Harvest Plus has done in terms of adding iron, vitamin A, zinc, and other nutrients to staple crops, with the idea that people then will eat these poor people will grow and eat these staple crops. And I think it's an excellent point. I think the benefits, the nutritional benefits of fortification, biofortification, and fortification of other food commodities, I think the track record is really good. And I think that the effort that's been put into biofortification has really increased awareness. The Global Panel had a big meeting with Harvest Plus in Rwanda, and there is a policy brief on our website.
First policy brief.
The first one? Is it really? Oh, a policy brief on biofortification. I thought it was the second, but anyway.
The first one was
he
the
knows.
overview.
Anyway, and I would just really recommend that you have a look at that, because I think it covers a lot of the issues that you say. One of the, this is to link to the next question about controversy on animal source foods. One of the questions is, if you're a policymaker, how do you look at the investment into sort of the biofortified seeds, expansion, management, supervision, etc., and how much do you encourage diversity of diet, including fruits and vegetables and nuts and legumes, as people have talked about? And to me, I don't see it as so much of a controversy, as because the answer is both and. But it does come out in terms of when you're making your research investments. Do you invest in the development of a new high iron millet, or do you invest in increasing the productivity and the marketability of vegetables? I mean, so that also have high iron, right? So I think that there's no easy answer to that in any case, but I really do think we have to take a both and. Biofortification is one approach, dietary diversity is another approach. I think we need to see how they work best and how they also tie into what consumers want and need. So I think we have a good way forward on that one. But do read the policy brief and get back to Patrick if you have questions.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So very briefly, very quickly on the animal source food controversy, it wasn't so much the green paper, it's the others, the JAMA, there's Lancet series, that have done the large-scale global assessments. They're not dividing up by low income, high income. They're looking at the role of animal source foods of various kinds: red meat, white meat, dairy, yogurt, cheese, right? Many different kinds, eggs. And it is about balance. It's about moderation. It's about those who need more should get more, and those who exceed limits really shouldn't exceed those limits. This research still needs to be done through those kind of epi-studies on essentially on dosing. What is appropriate. But then the other part is the ultra-processed foods. Include the sausages, the bacons, the red processed meats, which are generally seen as something that should be reduced. There's no question about that. And so they're coming from these large-scale dietary assessments. But that said, there's two domains of research in the last 10 years, I would say, which are essentially, on the one hand, looking at the role of some kind of dairy component, dairy, not meat, but dairy component, in foods that allow recovery from wasting, severe malnutrition, that promote long bone growth, so long bone or your leg bones that allow to reduce stunting, and cognitive outcomes, which are really another nutrition frontier question. And in all of those three, the evidence is pointing strongly towards the value of dairy in foods that address those kind of actions, those kind of outcomes. And there is a lot of ongoing product trials in the humanitarian space, in food aid, where composition of various foods is essential for addressing severe malnutrition or preventing moderate malnutrition. And again, the preponderance of evidence is suggesting that animal source foods, not foods, but components within foods, like porridges or ready-to-use foods, do seem to have quicker recovery rates and faster weight gain and so on, right? So there's those strands of research that are all kind of pointing together in the same direction. That does not mean that plant sources are not bad, are lesser. They're just different, right?
Okay, thanks. Let's take...
¿Qué hiciste de comida, en fin? ¿Qué hiciste de comida, en fin? ¿Comida qué hiciste entonces? Ya.
I don't know why you oppose the idea of like looking at farmers to like food like diets. Because look at Europe that now are struggling in terms of like how the farmers are getting the income when there is a monopoly of like some central that have access to the consumer. So I don't think necessarily that by working in the food system doesn't oppose the idea of making this food accessible in terms of like accessibility and the part of like how farmers actually access the consumer food system. So I don't know if Jaffee is working on this kind of thing. And then the second part of the question is that you talk about how it was difficult to deal with trade, which is what I first started. And here my question is, I don't know if you that is like, have we been measuring how we like help governments in making their ag subsidized and how this has a direct impact on the food access without even getting into like import export. Are we helping like food living organ? Is that something? Or are we just like even increasing the food quantity in general terms, but for the food group, are we talking about food sovereignty?
Okay, thank you. So we have the first one on the children, role of education and how we can change curricula, and then the role of the private sector, and then on a whole set of questions on trade and government policy and so on. So.
Okay, great. Interesting questions. Children as future consumers. It's a big issue. I couldn't go, obviously, into that. When they're very, very young, obviously, their caregivers play a huge role in determining what becomes the norm for these future consumers. And then very quickly, once they hit school, there's other peers who are influencing that. And we do need to be documented. We need to find out a lot more about those the channels of peer influence. But in theory, schools, yes, of course, offer a huge opportunity. But in practice, the evidence of really strong effectiveness is fairly weak, mainly because teachers are already being asked to do so much else. They've cut back on physical activity, even where there are fairly strict guidelines for healthy school meals, essentially. A lot of schools don't have the infrastructure. They don't have kitchens or cutting boards or what they need to actually facilitate good meals, and then you lose the opportunity to use that as an entry point for education. So, outside of curriculum, I'm talking about. So, all of that needs more attention. There are a growing number of examples across the U.S. and Europe in particular of, again, municipal level experiments, innovations. Shape Up Somerville outside Boston is one of those. But they didn't just use the school; they used the school as well as the mayor's office, as well as restaurants, as well as the parents. It takes a village approach, right? And found some successes. And those kinds of innovations are being replicated in other places. The question is, how do you build that up to scale and make it then possible through legislation and fiscal support, budgets, to make it possible at a national scale. The only other one I would studies that relate to how foods are presented, right? You can put an orange on a plate in a school, a line where the kids pick up their thing, right? And it's been shown fairly often, if there are oranges there, whole oranges, they just walk past, right? If they've been peeled and they're in segments on a plate, they will take them, right? So it comes back to your convenience and time issue. Right? There are issues about, I'll eat it as long as somebody's done all the hard work for me. Okay, that's exaggerating, but making it not just accessible but attractive and convenient to the consumer applies to kids, not just adult consumers. And we really haven't wrapped our heads around that enough. Trade matters hugely, and I agree. Nutritionists and nutrition and public health people don't talk about trade nearly enough. And one example is the Pacific Trade Agreement that was just torn up and thrown out. One calculation I saw said that it would have benefited U.S. farmers who produce fruits and vegetables by more than $50 billion a year, right, had that trade agreement been implemented. Right, so there's something, a real mismatch here.
Nuts.
Right? Yes,
Nuts.
quite nuts. Soup and nuts. So we need to be thinking about trade. There's potential value added from the production side as well as the consumer side.
That was an incredible set of questions, and I'll try not to talk for the next half hour. We do also have a policy brief on school meals. And one of the global panel members, Srinath Reddy, who's the head of the Public Health Foundation of India, was very, very strong on, because he's been involved in school meals, school feeding for years and years. And he said, we used to think that school meals were important to make the kids stay awake and to sort of learn better. And he said, actually, what we've discovered is that school meals are a way of talking with children about their food and about their eating. And helping, if done purposively, can actually help them to develop better habits of eating that they normally would not get, or they would not normally get at home. So just look up that thing, because I think that policy brief, because I think it's very helpful. Another thing, another area of the recommendations and the calls to action, and it links to the private sector question that was back there, is that marketing to children can be extremely powerful. So that if private sector companies want to market a high sugar added product, that's shaped like Nemo or, I don't know, Dora or something, and, they're 3 years old and they're not really, negotiable, right? That's going to have an effect. And I think I think we're going to see more studies, as many schools, for example, have prohibited marketing putting soft drink machines in schools and putting candy bar machines in schools, which encourage children in elementary schools and high schools to actually eat that stuff. So I think that the whole thing about labeling, the whole thing about marketing, the whole thing about packaging, all of those issues, which we kind of don't think about when we're thinking about agriculture and food production, but it has to do with how they're delivered to that particular age group and that particular set of future consumers, or current consumers as well as future consumers, is really important. On the private sector, in fact, it was something that Steve mentioned about how food safety is a public good. And I kind of agree with that, but it's not entirely a public responsibility. We did a policy brief on food safety, and Lynn Brown back there, I both worked hard on that one, partly because the public sector, government, does have a very strong role in setting grades and standards and enforcing those grades and standards for food, so that people don't get sick, right? On the other hand, given most normal government enforcement mechanisms, ain't no way that's going to happen without collaboration and engagement and taking responsibility by the private sector. So there's this collaboration that needs to happen between the public sector and the private sector to really make a food system work for safe food, convenient food, affordable food, available food, etc. Right? It's really a collaborative effort that we're looking at. The public sector, I think it comes out in the recommendations and the call to action, and you mentioned it, can do a much better job of aligning public sector investments in research with dietary goals and objectives and nutritional outcomes. Most of the research funding from the public sector goes to grains and roots, and to some extent animals, but more grains and roots. There's very little public sector money, research money, and innovation put into fruits, vegetables, nuts, pulses, etc. That's always kind of on the margins. So I think research is an area where the public sector can make a lot more investments that will be nutrition promoting, but they need to do it in a way that actually works with the private sector, just as you talked about, Tom, with regard to Harvest Plus. You can produce the seed, but ultimately we need the private sector seed producers, the input suppliers, etc., to take that role. So I think this food systems for nutrition, for diets, nutrition and diets and nutrition, really is a joint responsibility of public and private sectors, and figuring out who's leveraging who, I think, is an important part of that. Because I see the private sector innovation as being extremely powerful, coming up with new products, new ways of storing, new ways of responding. I mean, who knew 10 years ago that the private sector would be marketing kamut and quinoa and all kinds of things, which have become high nutrient, very attractive products. You can bet over the next 10 years, 20 years, there are going to be other food products out there that are going to be good for nutrition, but there are also going to be a lot of products out there that are going to be horrible. So I think that this public-private thing, and kind of looking at where the public sector and the private sector
need to work together and where they need to control, well, particularly the public sector needs to control the private sector perhaps a little bit better. So I think that was a really excellent question. We didn't actually answer your question about food sovereignty, so I'll let Kevin do it.
No, go ahead.
I mean,
you're on a roll.
I mean, this has been an issue that we actually on the panel haven't really been able to address very well, because trade in empirical terms is critical to food security, and it's critical to, with growing urbanization, it's critical to access in markets, right? So then you say, as we move away, as the world moves away from a subsistence production model, right? Can we, you have to take markets more into account, because that's how food moves from producer areas to consumer areas. The question, I think, though, has to do with, to me, the question on food sovereignty has to do with whether food self-sufficiency to preserve cultural preferences, to preserve long-time dietary habits, right, is something that should be promoted. And I think in this Food System and Diets report, there's a comment about the South Korean food policy, which actually emphasizes and proactively supports maintaining a traditional South Korean diet. Any South Koreans in the room? No. Kimchi, cabbage, a heavy emphasis on vegetables. And to some extent, that's considered food sovereignty, not in the sense of producing and consuming, right, but in the sense of sort of promoting a cultural thing. There's clearly a reaction globally against westernization of diets, but it is certainly moving in that direction. And I think this question is going to come up again and again. Should public institutions be intervening to stop this westernization, or should it be treated as kind of a fact of life and channeled and managed appropriately to result in a food environment that enables and encourages consumers to make the right dietary choices? Sure.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the topic because this is one of the...
Los bolsas de
one of the
dormir
laws we're
caben
battling
bien a
our
los
heads against in
chavalos, que
Indonesia.
alguien
So,
está vendiendo $5.
trying to become self-sufficient
Uno de
in
joven,
whatever,
adolescente, y otro de niño.
including fruits and vegetables. So they've applied administrative restrictions on 38 fruits and vegetables. The result being that the price of fruit and vegetables is extremely high. It's higher in Jakarta than it is in Singapore. And 94% of the population of Indonesia does not consume
No, deja de hablarme que estoy tratando.
So they're self-sufficient because nobody can afford to buy it. Right? That is one way of getting there. Look, the same thing on rice there, right? So they want to be self-sufficient. Okay, there, maybe it's a little bit more risky to rely on the world market. Retail price of rice is 70% higher than it is in Vietnam or Burma. So what does it do? It crowds out the poor's spending on healthy food, right? So on the one hand, you're sort of cutting your one arm off to save your leg, in a sense. I mean, they're more food sovereign, but for a middle-income country, they have completely unacceptable nutritional status and haven't improved anything, actually, since the mid-2000s, despite increased production of the things that they want to. So it all comes back to what the goalposts are. What are you expecting from your food system? What are you expecting from agricultural policy? If what you're expecting is more self-sufficiency, well, you got it. But someone else then has to define what the rules are, what the food policy is. Ministry of Agriculture should not be doing it if that's what they're coming with.
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay, I think we may have time for maybe one last question. Oh, two, I guess.
Let me take the first one.
Yeah, why don't you just go ahead?
Thank you very much. Jennifer Burns. I work on the nutrition side, so it's really opened up my eyes today to all the presentations and really thinking about agriculture and the entire food system.
like to have one or two things in mind that I'm going to go back and work on from my desk. And, but I sense from Steve's remarks this is a lot to work with and fix, and there's no easy solution. I hear Patrick say that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So thinking through the NGO role, where we're well placed in a lot of communities. We're in 101 countries. We've got vast networks in a lot of different places. Doing probably less on the policy side and more at the community level. But would you say a recommendation is to sit down for a 5-day meeting with the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Health, some private sector, some civil society, some NGOs, a couple different people spread all across the area to do a full analysis, as is outlined in the foresight report, of doing a thorough look at the food system and saying, okay, this is what we think fits for this context, this country, this sort of thing. This is an ideal world with lots of time, lots of money, and everybody's available. But it's something that we're talking through with doing some university partners and global panel, and we think we have an idea, but I just love your recommendations.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll just take another couple and focus on this one. That is someone wondering to what extent nutrition responsive agriculture can have an impact. The 1,000 days window is the most effective one in preventing stunting, doing things like looking at different services or service provision that would focus on sort of as in the larger context of family diets. And she's wondering if there's any sort of success stories to be effective in improving complementary foods for children, for farmer field schools, nutrition action groups, or nature. Super easy again.
In 1 minute.
Go ahead, Patrick. That's a question.
Thanks again for great questions. I mean, have a look.